I come to you from Queensland via New Zealand with 17 years experience in emergency services here in Australia and 11 as a police officer in New Zealand, and various voluntary roles in emergency management, surf life saving. I'm hoping though that trans-Tasman rivalry aside, that you'll take me on as you have done many exports from New Zealand, like Far Lap, Split Ends. For the young ones, that's kind of Crowded House, and the Pavlova. So take me and embrace me as one of your own today.
Cheeky.
So we have, I'm very humbled actually by the expertise we have in this panel today. I'll introduce, and the instructions were to just give the one-liner, and if you do want to have a look at their experience, have a look at their bios. It's very daunting for me, being a pracademic. So I'll just get you to raise your hands as we're going along. So we have Professor Dale Dominey House, who's a Professor of Hazard and Disaster Risk Sciences in Sydney University. And he'll be doing a little presentation on LGBTI people and disasters in New South Wales, Queensland and New Zealand. We have Leroy Moronian. He's a community educator for CFA in the South West region, and Leroy will be talking about his experiences in CFA. We have Alyssa Duncan, research assistant in the Gender and Disaster Pod, and her topic will be LGBTI and emergency management. Liam Leonard. Liam's got the most acronyms aside from emergency services that I've seen, but I'll say it in full. So he's the Director of Gay and Lesbian Health Victoria, which sits within the Australian Research Centre in Sex, Health and Society, or do you say it just Arches? Which is La Trobe University. And Liam will be speaking on LGBTI people in emergencies in Victoria. And also Emily Dwyer. Emily's the Managing Director of Edge Effect. And Emily will be covering insights on inclusion of gender and sexual minorities in international disaster risk reduction. If I'd said their whole bios, it probably would have taken the whole time, and it's more important that we hear them speak and we get some question time in there as well. But I did want to do a little activity, because I've got a training background and you always love to do stuff. So the panel's going to be undertaking the activity, and you have a really crucial role, because you are the silent observers. And at the end of the activity, you're going to come up with some amazing insights, analogies and observations for us to get us in the mode of what we're going to be talking here today. If you have an emotional response to the activity like instrument that I'm using, it's okay. So did our psych at work. So I'm just going to set up here. So Liam, I'll shout. Liam's quite generously consented to being blindfolded for this.
Consent is a very loose term here.
So I'm not going to give any instructions, just I'm going to hand out a few things.
This is what we all want.
So, you know, you've seen one of those before. I'm sure everybody in Australia and New Zealand would have. I'm just going to hand out some things as we go along, and then you can start, Dale, if you like.
Okay, right. So the expectation is, I guess, that I'm going to work out what to do.
Whatever you like, my friend.
Success.
But if I want to
So do you want to hand? Oh, you can do whatever you like with those. Do you want to show them what you've got?
I'm going to keep that one. I don't know why. Those are something different.
I think so.
Doesn't quite fit. Okay. Hang on. Let me try something. Now put it in. So here you go, Liam. I'm just going to hand you something there.
Yes.
And then I'm just going to hand you something else, and you put your right hand out. Okay.
Yes.
So can you try and find a space for that?
This is a form of animal cruelty, in my opinion, at this stage. No, I can't.
You can't? Okay, that's right. You hold on to that one.
Right.
And I'll take this one from you. And there you go. I'll just pass it over there to Leroy. You'll show them what... Oh, should we take it out and show them what you've got?
You can come up with anyone.
Oh, no, I just brought this out. What happened with that one? Oh, there you go.
It could go into any spot possible.
Okay. Cool. I think you can take your blindfold off now. Thanks. All right, now, you all taking your role in this activity really seriously, weren't you? Yeah. Okay, so we do have a prize for the most insightful observation in this little miniature one. All right, so any ideas, any insights from that activity as to what we're talking about today? Diversity in general, or LGBTI as being a diverse group in emergency management disasters. Say it nice and loud.
I thought it was interesting that the panel members thought the rules were that they weren't allowed to help the one who had the blindfold.
Ah, nice. Yes. Anything else? Audience, yeah, thank you.
I had the same point, but actually I didn't understand why they didn't help each other anyway, whether they had the blindfold or not.
Okay, so whilst I didn't set it up as a competition, it actually...
They didn't help each other, but then nobody asked for help. They all thought, I've got to deal with this on my own.
Okay. It could be just that I'm not a very good trainer, but and the activity came about from a random comment to a colleague of mine going, it's like, the Tupperware shape thing. So that's where that, yeah, Donna.
I felt that you had a little bit of expertise to offer, and when we got to the roadblock of one that didn't fit, actually by going to your expertise about what you could do this, because you've done it before,
Yep.
so you know this might be a little bit of a workaround, and that actually got good results if getting them inside of that thing was the objective, which we weren't clear about.
No, it wasn't. I didn't really give any instructions, did I? Yep.
Just the automatic presumption right at the very beginning when you actually handed out the puzzle, that everyone would have seen that before.
Yeah, true.
So that everyone would know how to complete that puzzle.
So what could the actual shape sort of be? What could that be?
Different people going into different places.
Okay, Dale, you're going to pick the most insightful comment. Yeah, I didn't get. I've just put this on you right now.
Under pressure. Well, for me, the take-home message is that we shouldn't assume that a one-size-fits-all, and that different people will have different expectations and needs, but also capacities in terms of what they can do to fit together in this whole.
Sure. Any other comments from before we make the big announcement of the winner? Emily, why did you decide to keep one of your shapes?
I don't think we should be putting people in boxes all the time.
Perfect.
So I thought this one can roam free.
Nice.
Yeah.
Anything else?
I thought the not helping each other was an interesting comment because I saw where yours fit in and I didn't say anything.
William, how did you feel?
How did I feel? Well, as the only one with the blindfold, I thought, here I am being singled out in odd and wonderful ways, really. Yeah.
Yep, Leroy?
Yeah, I think I agree with what Emily was saying, is that we try and fit people into certain boxes and stuff, depending on who you yourself think they are, whereas they might not be that kind of person. So we've got to keep a more open mind and be able to open it up to be able to fit them in.
Nice. All right, I'm just going to give this to our stand, please. So if I could invite to the podium, Dale.
Oh, he's going to go to the...
Well, hello everyone, welcome, and thank you so much for coming along to this session. So I've been asked to do two things. The first is to provide a brief overview that gives a bit of a trajectory of where research and policy-oriented work in relationship to sexual and gender minorities has come from over the last few years. And secondly, to spend a few minutes sharing the results of a project that my colleagues Andrew Gorman-Murray and Scott McKinnon, who are referenced here, have been working on in the context of Australia and New Zealand. So that's what I'll attempt to do. So if this works. As you well know, the Asia-Pacific region and Australia and New Zealand specifically is a geographic area that's regularly affected by a range of disaster types. And mirroring global trends, something like 80% of the disasters that affect us are so-called hydrometeorological in origin. That is, they're weather and climate related. Given processes such as anthropogenic climate change can be expected to drive changes in the frequency and impact of those weather and climate related disasters in the future, impacts on individuals, families and communities, governments and the emergency services will all increase in terms of their likely impacts and effects. When thinking about impacts and effects, these are never uniformly experienced or evenly distributed. For a whole range of social, political, economic and historic reasons, different groups of people are affected and have differential levels of vulnerability and resilience for a whole range of underlying reasons and characteristics associated with their social groups. And that scholarly, academic and policy-oriented research is critically needed to help understand what those underlying processes are that contribute both to resilience and the vulnerability of particular groups, especially when those groups are marginalised from wider society. Furthermore, and you'll already know this, and in some ways it's been partly alluded to with the introductory talk that Maureen gave us this morning, the United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction contends that these underlying social differences between different groups of people that live in places should be understood and accommodated in disaster risk reduction policy making, planning, response and recovery arrangements, because that underlying social vulnerability does underpin the experiences that individuals, families and communities have. So over the decades, more and more work has been undertaken in order to unpack and understand the experiences of different groups. But until relatively recently, one set of communities that was largely absent from this scholarly and policy-related work were lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered and intersex people that constitute a variety of communities, and I see them as plural, not singular, although we tend to often collapse all of these diverse people into one group or one acronym. And until about the mid-2010 onwards, not much research had been done. So when Andrew, Scott and I set about on our own research project focusing on the experiences of sexual and diverse people in Australia and New Zealand, we began by reviewing the available information that was already out there. And we were somewhat surprised to see there actually really wasn't very much as we set out in 2014. Just very quickly, I'm going to draw your attention to the principal case study material that we didn't know about. So there's a few little images missing off here, but don't worry. The first case study was the impacts of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans that impacted a large and diverse set of LGBTI communities. There were four principal take-home messages. The first was related to governance and policy arrangements that assumed for response and recovery arrangements that a family was defined as a heterosexual binary male-female and their biologically dependent children. So families that didn't fit that binary heteronormative structure were actually exempted from receiving the kind of support and recovery arrangements that heterosexual people, married or unmarried, and their families actually received. So policy was exclusionary. The second was the ongoing anti-discrimination practices, particularly amplified by right-wing religious organisations, further exemplified the impacts of the disaster that members of the LGBTI communities experienced in New Orleans. Thirdly, the experiences of members of those communities were not the same. Middle-aged white gay men had different experiences to bisexual African American women, etc., etc. So we were also able to, or researchers demonstrated, that some particular groups within that larger set of communities really had very, very problematic experiences in disasters. And that also comes down to intersectionality, which we were introduced earlier. But lastly, on a positive note, networks of resilience and resistance and capability emerged organically as members of those communities work cooperatively to usurp and get around those heteronormative processes that were broadly marginalising them from the relief and recovery arrangements. Another significant example was the earthquake that impacted Haiti in 2010. In Haiti, the situation was different in that being lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered or intersex is illegal. And so identities were broadly privately concealed and not publicly displayed. But the earthquake disaster disrupted that private identity by destroying the homes and the community and the private spaces that members of these communities would live in and cooperate and work together, including critically mental and physical health services that were provided by organisations. Once again, very similar experiences to communities that were impacted in New Orleans, but also researchers found that lesbians, bisexuals, transgender women and intersex persons were the subject of rape, violence and coercive attacks inside otherwise safe shelters, and that broadly the police were complicit and silent when such violent attacks were reported. The last of the case studies is that a number of disaster events through the 2000s affected various Southeast Asian countries, and in these countries non-binary genders are present within a number of societies. Again, in many cases these non-gender binaries and sexual and gender diverse people are non-mainstream but find ways of building resilience and resistance within their own communities. But scholarship showed that broadly these people were marginalised and not captured by response and recovery arrangements, demonstrating that members of LGBTIQ communities across countries and cultural settings experience similar, same, but different experiences. So against that context, Andrew, Scott and I set about asking the question, what are the experiences of members of these communities to a range of disaster events that impacted Australia and New Zealand in the near recent past? And we focused on the earthquake in Christchurch in New Zealand, and then a number of flood, tropical cyclone and bushfire, wildfire events in various places in Australia. We built partnerships with several organisations and built a research team to assist us. I can't possibly summarise all of the things that we did in 3 years, but I want to share just 4 quick take-home messages. Firstly, leadership starts at the top. Legislation of our governments, policies, plans and practices of our emergency services and the organisations that support preparedness, response and recovery play a major role. Policy analysis that we undertook in the Australian context, particularly my home state, New South Wales, showed that the response and recovery arrangements are outsourced to third-party organisations by government. Those third-party organisations are largely Christian, faith-based organisations. Those same organisations had applied for and been granted anti-discrimination exemptions under federal law. So we found cases of these organisations receiving taxpayer money to provide response and recovery arrangements, denying service to members of the LGBTI communities on the basis of their faith. Such context needs to change. That was the first take-home message that I'd like to share. The second was really this concept of the destruction of safe space and what constitutes safe space. So once again, the experiences of members of these communities in shelters were often problematic. Even the check-in arrangements where you fill in the sheet to sort of say who you are, particularly capturing binary gender norms of male-female. immediately made people feel different and vulnerable in spaces. And public shelters are not very friendly for trans and intersex people, where we have single-sex gender identifying bathrooms. Third take-home message was the way in which media, local and national, tells the stories of the experiences of survivors of disasters. Whose faces do we see portrayed in media and news imagery stories? They are largely heterosexual and family-oriented stories. The fourth, and I think the critical message that I'd like to share, is the capacity and the resilience and the resistance of members of the LGBTI communities who have found ways of building capacity. And I might also add, we were also touched by a whole range of stories of sensitive and inclusionary emergency management practice in a whole range of places where individuals reached out and were inclusionary in terms of their practices. I've really flown through very quickly a large and complex project, but some take-home messages. I place a challenge on myself and members of my communities, of which I'm a part, that we have a role in reaching out and building and fostering relationships with the emergency services and government. And I would encourage governments and emergency services to find ways of building relationships with LGBTI organisations and individuals as they move forward. I'll leave it there, but I hope that that broad context provides a framework that my fellow panel members will now extend upon and build upon. So thank you so much for your time.